Sarah stood at the gate watching passengers shuffle onto the plane, the hustle of the crowd drowned out by the low hum of the air conditioning. She shifted her gaze to a frail elderly woman, slowly making her way toward the entrance arcane, tapping with every step. The woman's face was creased with age, but her eyes seemed distant, as if locked in some place far away. Sarah didn't know why, but she felt an odd sense of frustration bubbling up inside her. This wasn't her first flight of the day, and already she could feel the tension in her shoulders. The elderly woman, Margaret, she assumed by the way she walked with a slight limp, was taking forever her pace, was agonizingly slow. Sarah could tell the woman was already exhausted. Before the flight even began, as Margaret reached the gate, Sarah reluctantly stepped forward and offered a polite but forced smile to help her on board. The woman nodded quietly, mumbling her thanks, but her movements were shaky, almost as though she wasn't fully aware of her surroundings. Sarah gave a small sigh as she gestured for the woman to follow. She noticed the woman's coat was bulky and wrinkled, perhaps a result of sitting in it for too long. A slight shiver ran through Sarah's spine as she watched the woman struggle to lift the bag resting on her shoulder. Sarah shifted her weight from one foot to the other, tapping her pen. Nervously, she had a million things to do today, and this wasn't part of the plan. She could already tell this would be a long flight with this woman adding to the workload. Sarah just hoped Margaret wouldn't ask for too much help. It was always the elderly who seemed to ask the most simple yet time-consuming requests. Just one more thing to add to an already overwhelming shift, she thought as she moved to the side to let Margaret pass. She couldn't help but wonder what it was like to be that age. The woman was so fragile, almost invisible to the other passengers. But Sarah had no time to dwell on it. She had work to do. And this wasn't supposed to be a deep emotional experience. This was a job, and jobs were meant to be handled efficiently. But the more Sarah watched Margaret slowly shuffle down the aisle, the more her frustration grew. Margaret had difficulty finding her seat. Despite the flight attendants assisting her, she hesitated at every row, glancing up at the seat numbers and back down at her boarding pass. Each time her face crunched in confusion, Sarah felt her patience wearing thin as the other passengers settled in and the overhead compartments slammed shut. She noticed Margaret hesitating in front of a middle seat. She moved to step in to help, but before she could approach, the elderly woman finally made her way to the seat. A small win, Sarah thought. But that was only the beginning. Margaret wasn't finished yet. She had a new request. Sarah could feel her heart sink. She could already feel the long list of things she still had to do. She had no time for this. This woman was like every other demanding elderly passenger who never seemed to know when to stop. But as Sarah approached, Margaret noticed her hands shaking slightly when she reached for her seatbelt. Her eyes were lowered, her face flushed red. Sarah stopped mid-step. A strange feeling came over her, a flicker of guilt perhaps, or just surprise that she hadn't noticed how fragile this woman was until now. She stepped forward with a practiced smile. She crouched beside Margaret, trying to mask her growing unease. The old woman barely spoke. As she tried to tug at the belt, Sarah offered a quiet and almost reluctant word of encouragement. When Margaret glanced up at her, their eyes met for a brief second, and Sarah couldn't help but see something in those eyes, a hint of something more than just a tired elderly woman staring back. It was a quiet strength hidden deep inside Margaret's gaze. Sarah quickly averted her eyes, uncomfortable with the sudden shift in energy. But something had changed. She couldn't explain it yet, but she knew her judgment was beginning to shift just a little. She helped the woman with the seatbelt as she'd done 100 times before, but this time it felt different. There was a weight in the air, something unspoken that lingered between them. She smiled at Margaret politely, but the gesture felt hollow as she stood and walked away. Margaret's face remained calm, but there was an unsettling depth in her eyes. As Sarah turned to leave, she heard Margaret speak barely above a whisper. "I haven't flown alone in years. My husband always made sure I was okay." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah blinked for a moment. She wasn't sure why, but her pulse quickened. Something about the way Margaret spoke didn't sit right. It was a simple sentence, but it stirred something in Sarah, a sense of guilt, or maybe it was curiosity, but she couldn't pinpoint it not yet. She walked back to her station, her mind racing. Sarah had a job to do, and she pushed the feeling aside as she tried to focus on the tasks ahead. But in the back of her mind, Margaret's words echoed, "My husband always made sure I was okay." As the plane soared higher, Sarah tried to shake off the strange feeling Margaret had left behind. She went through the usual routine, checking seatbelts, making sure everyone had their drinks and snacks. But her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment, the quiet vulnerability in Margaret's voice. When she mentioned her husband, Sarah tried to ignore it, telling herself she had more important things to focus on. It was just another passenger who needed help, just like the others. But as the hours passed, something in the back of her mind noted her. There was something about Margaret that felt different. She could see her out of the corner of her eye every now. And then the elderly woman sitting quietly, staring out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face calm. Yet there was an aura of sadness that seemed to surround her like a shadow. Sarah noticed the way Margaret moved so carefully, as if every motion took great effort. She'd look around the cabin with a distant expression, but never engage with anyone. It was as if she had retreated into herself, as though she were in another world. Sarah couldn't help but wonder how many people had passed her by today, not even noticing the quiet grief in her eyes, the loneliness that lingered just beneath the surface. But as the flight continued, Sarah couldn't shake the thought that there was something more to Margaret's story, something hidden beneath that frail exterior. She looked up from her work and found herself staring at Margaret again. The woman's face was turned slightly towards the aisle, her eyes soft but intense, as if she were studying the world outside. Sarah tried to look away, but something kept pulling her back. Margaret's eyes flicked up, meeting Sarah's gaze for a brief moment, and then quickly looking away. It wasn't the look of someone seeking attention, but the look of someone lost in their own memories, a person who had seen more than she was willing to share. Sarah felt an odd twinge in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite place. She had seen this before in other people, the quiet sorrow that hung in the air. Yet this was different. It was deeper, more complicated. But before Sarah could figure it out, Margaret spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could I ask for some help?" Sarah blinked, startled by the sudden request. She had almost forgotten Margaret was even there. She turned to face the elderly woman with a tight smile. "Of course," she said, though she didn't feel as enthusiastic as she usually did. Margaret hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I can't seem to get comfortable in this seat. My back's been bothering me all day, and I was wondering if you could adjust it just a little." Her voice was weak, but there was no hint of impatience or demand. It was the quiet voice of someone who had asked for so little in life, but now needed a little kindness. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to push aside her irritation. She walked over to Margaret's seat and gently adjusted the backrest, making sure she was comfortable, all the while trying to mask the growing discomfort in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about this woman's calm presence that unsettled her. Margaret smiled softly in thanks, but there was something in her eyes that stopped Sarah from walking away just yet. Margaret's gaze was steady and purposeful as she looked up at Sarah. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said, her voice quieter this time. Sarah raised an eyebrow, not sure where this conversation was headed. "What is it?" she asked, half expecting a simple request for water or another pillow. But Margaret's words were far from what she expected. "You're a young woman with a whole life ahead of you, aren't you?" Margaret's voice held a depth that Sarah wasn't prepared for. "Yes," Sarah replied slowly, "I guess I am." But before she could move, Margaret continued, "Do you ever think about what it means to truly live, to make choices that matter, to stand up for what you believe in even when it's hard?" Her words hung in the air as Sarah felt an unexpected weight settle on her shoulders. She was caught off guard. The flight attendant, who had dealt with countless passengers, was now being asked something much deeper, something far more personal than she was prepared for. She paused, unsure of how to respond, but Margaret wasn't finished. I had to make choices in my life, choices that were difficult ones that cost me more than I ever imagined. Margaret's voice trailed off, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a shiver run down her spine as the old woman's words began to sink in. Sarah took a step back, trying to regain control of her emotions. "I'm sure you've had your own challenges," Sarah replied, unsure of where this conversation was going, but there was something about Margaret's presence that made her feel small, as if all their complaints and frustrations suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of this woman's quiet strength. "We all have," Margaret said softly, her eyes filled with a wisdom that Sarah couldn't quite place yet. "But sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that change us forever." The weight of Margaret's words hit Sarah hard. She didn't know why, but she felt as though something had shifted between them. The young flight attendant and the elderly woman had unknowingly connected in that brief exchange. It was as if Margaret had reached into her soul and touched something she didn't know was there. Sarah felt a strange chill as Margaret's words echoed in her mind. The plane hummed steadily as the minutes passed, but Sarah's thoughts were no longer on the flight or her duties. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed between them. But what was it? She barely knew this woman, yet Margaret's presence had begun to stir something inside her. She walked back to her station, feeling a strange weight in her chest. The usual noise of the cabin felt distant now, as if she were in a different world entirely. She could still see Margaret's face in her mind, the way her eyes had looked at her, so steady and sure, as if she knew something Sarah didn't. She could feel the old woman's gaze on her, still like a quiet whisper calling her to understand something deeper than just her simple requests for help. Sarah tried to focus on her tasks, but it was impossible. Her mind kept drifting back to Margaret's words about choices, about standing up for what you believe in. How many times had Sarah made choices in her life without thinking beyond the immediate result? How many times had she simply gone along with things because it was easier than standing up for what she truly believed in? The thought unsettled her, but she pushed it aside, deciding that it was just the fatigue of a long flight messing with her head. She continued to serve drinks and snacks, trying to focus on her work, but the nagging thought wouldn't go away. There was something about Margaret's calm demeanor, her quiet strength, that made Sarah feel uneasy, but also strangely curious. She noticed the woman again, sitting in her seat, looking out the window, her hands clasped neatly in her lap, the same quiet stillness around her. Sarah could see that Margaret wasn't speaking to anyone. No one was sitting near her. No one seemed to be paying her any mind. And yet Sarah felt like the woman was somehow at the center of everything. She was alone, but there was a quiet power in her solitude that commanded attention, as if Margaret had learned something that Sarah hadn't. She felt compelled to approach Margaret again. She didn't know why, but she needed to know more about this woman, the way she carried herself with such quiet dignity, as though she had weathered storms and yet remained unbroken. Sarah walked over slowly, not sure what she was going to say when she got there. But when she reached Margaret's seat, the elderly woman looked up at her and smiled, that same soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't mean to interrupt your work," Margaret said, her voice gentle. As ever, Sarah was taken aback by how calm she seemed, how serene. But there was still something there, something in the way Margaret spoke that made Sarah feel uneasy, but in a way she couldn't explain. "It's no trouble," Sarah said quickly. "I'm just checking on everyone." Margaret's smile faded slightly, and she tilted her head as if studying Sarah. "You're a good person," Margaret said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." Sarah was startled by the sudden compliment. She wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't like the usual small talk she was used to from passengers. It was like Margaret had seen something deeper, something Sarah had never even acknowledged in herself. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing away for a moment before meeting Margaret's gaze again. "I don't know about that," Sarah said with a nervous laugh. "I'm just doing my job." But Margaret wasn't convinced. She shook her head slowly. "It's not just your job, though, is it? There's more to you than that." Her voice was calm, but insistent. "Sometimes the hardest thing in life is finding the courage to be who you truly are, to stop pretending to be what the world expects you to be, and start being what you need to be." The words hit Sarah like a wave. It was as if Margaret had peeled back a layer she hadn't even known existed, and was staring directly at the part of her that she had buried deep down, a part that didn't fit into the neat little life she had created for herself. As a flight attendant, the part of her that longed for something more, but was too afraid to act on it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this to be what the conversation would turn into, but there was something about Margaret's wisdom that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. "I don't know what you mean," Sarah said quietly, trying to brush it off. But Margaret's gaze never wavered. "You will one day," she said softly. "Life has a way of showing us who we really are. When we least expect it, sometimes we just need to listen." Sarah's heart raced. She wasn't sure what to say, but as Margaret fell silent, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. It was as though the entire world had paused around them. Sarah was left standing there, caught in a moment of stillness. As the flight continued onward, the words lingering in her mind, "Life has a way of showing us who we really are when we least expect it." Sarah wasn't sure what Margaret meant, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was being asked to listen, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. As the hours passed, the flight seemed to drag on, but in her mind, everything had changed. The cabin noise, the hum of the engines, the announcements over the PA system, all felt distant now, as if she were watching everything from a distance. She kept thinking about Margaret, and the things she had said about choices, about being true to yourself. The words echoed in her mind like a mantra, but Sarah didn't know how to respond to them. She had never thought about her life that way. Sure, she had moments where she wished things were different, but she had always convinced herself that it was easier to just keep going, to just follow the routine and let the world pass by. It wasn't until Margaret had looked at her so directly, so calmly, that she started questioning the life she had built. Was she really happy? Was she truly living? Or was she just going through the motions? She tried to focus on her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to Margaret's face, her eyes so knowing yet full of quiet sadness. It wasn't long before she found herself walking back toward the elderly woman again. This time it wasn't out of duty, but curiosity. She had to know more. She had to understand what it was that had changed her so much. Something in the way Margaret spoke, the way she carried herself, made Sarah feel as though she had been living in a fog. She reached Margaret's seat again and noticed that the woman was no longer staring out the window, but instead had her hands resting on her lap, her fingers lightly tapping the fabric of her pants. As if lost in thought, Sarah hesitated for a moment. But then Margaret spoke in that soft voice. "You're back," she said with a knowing smile. Sarah sat down beside her for the first time in the whole flight. The woman wasn't asking for anything. Instead, Margaret seemed to be waiting to speak. But Sarah wasn't sure what to say, so she asked the only thing that felt right. "What do you mean by all of that?" She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "The part about finding the courage to be who I really am." Margaret looked at her then with eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "Do you feel like you've been pretending all this time?" Margaret asked, her voice surprisingly sharp, in contrast to her usual tone. Sarah swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected this. But it was the question she had been avoiding for so long. She wasn't sure how to answer. All she knew was that she felt stuck, trapped in a life that didn't feel like her own. She had done everything she thought she should, but somewhere along the way she had lost herself. She had become the flight attendant, the one who was always there for everyone, but never really there for herself. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just feel like I'm not really living." She looked away, then her throat tight with emotion. It was the first time she had admitted it out loud. She had always buried those feelings under the pressure of her job, the expectations of her family. But now in this moment, sitting beside this woman who seemed so small yet so powerful, she couldn't pretend anymore. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She simply sat there, her hands resting on her lap, her face soft with understanding. "It's not easy," Margaret said after a moment, "to look at yourself and admit that you're not where you want to be. It takes strength." Sarah felt the weight of her words settle on her heart. She didn't know why, but she felt a sudden sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this. Margaret understood her feelings. Even if she didn't know all the details, it was enough to know that someone saw her for who she really was. "But you can still change." Margaret continued, her voice steady now. "You can choose to do things differently. You can choose to stop pretending and live for yourself." Sarah looked at Margaret then for the first time, fully seeing her not just as an old woman sitting quietly, but as someone who had lived through so much, had faced real loss, had found a way to survive, and still had the strength to keep going. There was something about Margaret's presence that made Sarah believe anything was possible, but at the same time it made her feel incredibly small. She felt the weight of her own choices, the weight of her own fear. "I don't know if I can," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "It seems too hard." Margaret smiled gently and shook her head. "The hardest things are always the ones worth doing. It's the fear that holds us back. But fear doesn't have to control us." Sarah felt a warmth in her chest at those words. It wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't like everything suddenly made sense. But in that moment, she knew she had been given something valuable, a new way of looking at her life, a new way of looking at herself. Margaret turned her gaze to the window again, her eyes distant but peaceful. "Sometimes it takes years to find the courage to live authentically," Margaret said quietly. "And sometimes it takes just one conversation to change everything." Sarah didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she was ready to stop pretending. She felt like she was ready to face the truth of who she really was. And for the first time in years, she felt free. The plane continued its steady course through the sky, but for Sarah it felt like time had slowed down, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Her mind buzzed with the conversation she had just shared with Margaret. The things the old woman had said lingered in her thoughts. Like a quiet whisper, she couldn't ignore it. It was as if Margaret had unlocked something in her, a part of herself that she had hidden away for far too long. As Sarah walked down the aisle again, she found herself watching the elderly woman. Margaret hadn't spoken much after their last conversation, but Sarah could tell she was deep in thought. There was a peaceful calm around her, like she had already made peace with everything that had ever happened in her life. And somehow Sarah invited her that peace. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt that way, to just let go and be at peace with who she was, with the choices she had made. She knew she had been running for so long, but now it felt like the running had caught up with her. She had spent so much of her life trying to be someone else, trying to please others. And in doing so, she had forgotten who she truly was. She didn't know where to start or how to make things right. But she knew something had to change. Margaret had shown her that sometimes the hardest thing was to admit, when you were lost, to admit that you didn't have all the answers. And that was okay. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had allowed herself to be vulnerable. She had been the one everyone relied on, the strong one, the dependable one, but now she felt like a different person, someone who was finally starting to listen to her own heart, to what she really wanted, not what was expected of her. She returned to her duties, but it felt different. Somehow her movements were slower, more deliberate, and she found herself looking at her passengers differently. She noticed the small things, the way a mother gently held her child's hand, or how an older couple held hands as they spoke quietly to each other. Sarah had always seen people in the same way, as just another passenger, another face to serve. But now she saw them as individuals with their own stories, their own burdens to carry. And for the first time she realized how much she had been missing all these years. As she walked past Margaret's seat again, she felt the urge to speak to her again. There was something there, something she needed to understand more deeply something in Margaret's quiet wisdom that she couldn't ignore. She stopped beside the elderly woman, unsure of what to say, but Margaret seemed to know before Sarah even spoke. "You're thinking again." Margaret said, her voice warm but perceptive. Sarah nodded, slightly unsure of how to put her feelings into words. "I feel like I'm changing," she said after a moment, "like something inside me is waking up." Margaret smiled softly. "That's the first step," she said simply, "to wake up to your own truth, to stop living for others, and start living for yourself." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. Margaret's words resonated deeply within her, but she still felt scared, still unsure of what that would mean. What would happen if she stopped pretending? What would happen if she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to be real with everyone, including herself? She had spent so long building walls around her heart, walls she didn't even realize were there until now. Margaret must have seen the doubt in her eyes, because she spoke again, her voice gentle. "Fear is a natural part of change, but don't let it stop you. Fear is not your enemy." Sarah swallowed hard. It felt like her entire world was shifting around her. She had always been afraid of change, afraid of what it would mean for her life and the people around her. But now Margaret was showing her that change didn't have to be something to fear. It could be the key to something better, something more authentic. "I've been afraid for so long," Sarah admitted, her voice shaky. "Afraid of letting go, afraid of what people might think if I stopped trying to be perfect." Margaret nodded slowly. "The world will always have opinions about you, but what matters most is what you think of yourself." Margaret's voice was firm, but kind. It was like she was teaching Sarah something she had learned long ago, something that had taken her a lifetime to understand. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a shift within herself, a shift that felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time. For the first time, she felt like she was truly ready to face the unknown, to step into the world without all the masks and pretenses that had kept her hidden for so long. Margaret looked at Sarah one last time before turning her gaze back to the window, her expression softening with what seemed like quiet satisfaction. "You've already begun the journey, Sarah," she said with a knowing smile. "The hardest part is over." Sarah didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew she would never be the same. She had spent so many years searching for answers outside herself, but the answers had always been inside her. She just needed to listen. The flight had long crossed into the quiet hours of the night. The cabin lights dimmed and most passengers had settled into a peaceful sleep. But for Sarah, sleep was impossible. Her mind was too restless, too full of everything that had happened over the past few hours. She had always prided herself on being in control of everything, on being the one who could handle any situation. But now she felt like she was losing her grip on everything, as if the ground she stood on was shifting beneath her feet. She couldn't stop thinking about Margaret, and the strange pull the woman seemed to have on her. Her words still echoed in her mind, louder than any noise from the plane or the chatter of passengers in the cabin. "Fear is not your enemy." Sarah had always feared change, feared the unknown, feared what might happen if she allowed herself to truly let go. But Margaret had shown her a different way, a way of living that wasn't bound by fear, wasn't dictated by others' expectations. Margaret had been through so much in her life, and yet she carried herself with such grace, such quiet strength. And for the first time in Sarah's life, she realized that she didn't have to keep pretending. She didn't have to live up to anyone else's standards, but her own. She felt a strange mixture of relief and fear, like she was on the verge of something life-changing, but she didn't know what it was or how to even begin. It was as if the floodgates of her own emotions had finally opened, and all the feelings she had buried for years were coming to the surface. But what would happen if she allowed herself to feel them? What would happen if she stopped hiding behind her smile, her uniform, her job? What would happen if she finally faced everything she had been running from? Sarah couldn't answer those questions yet, but she knew she had to find out. As the plane continued its journey, Sarah found herself walking the aisles again, checking on passengers, ensuring everything was in order. But this time she couldn't ignore the sense of weight in the air, the tension that seemed to hang around her. Every step, she saw the tired faces of the passengers, some sleeping, others reading quietly, and for the first time she realized that every single person on this plane was carrying their own story, their own struggles, their own burdens. It made her feel small, but in a way it also made her feel connected to them all. She had spent so many years focused on her own problems, her own insecurities, but now she saw that she wasn't alone in this world. Everyone was struggling, everyone was fighting their own battles. And maybe that's what life was really about. Maybe it wasn't about having everything figured out or being perfect. Maybe it was about connecting with others in their humanity, about accepting the things you couldn't change, and finding peace within yourself. She glanced toward Margaret's seat again. The woman was still awake, staring out the window, the soft glow of the moonlight illuminating her face. She seemed so at peace, so calm, as if she had already made her peace with everything. Sarah stood there for a long moment, watching her, wondering what it would be like to have that kind of peace, to be free of the doubts and fears that had weighed her down for so long. Margaret turned her head. Then, as if sensing Sarah's gaze, their eyes met again. And for the first time, Sarah saw something in Margaret's eyes that she hadn't noticed before. A quiet understanding, a recognition, as if the old woman knew exactly what Sarah was going through. And it made Sarah feel like maybe she wasn't as lost as she thought. Maybe Margaret had seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. Yet Sarah stepped forward, slowly, not sure of what to say, but Margaret spoke first, her voice calm as always. "You're wondering what comes next, aren't you?" she said. And Sarah nodded without thinking. It was true. She was scared of the unknown, scared of what would happen if she changed, scared of stepping into a new life where nothing was certain. "It's all right to be scared." Margaret continued, her voice gentle but firm. "The unknown can be a frightening thing, but it can also be beautiful. It can be where you finally find yourself." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, hearing the truth in those words for the first time. It wasn't that she had to have everything figured out. It wasn't that she had to control every aspect of her life. But maybe for the first time she could allow herself to be free, to let go of all the things that had held her back for so long. She had spent so many years trying to live up to expectations, trying to be everything for everyone. But she had never asked herself what she truly needed, what she wanted for herself. Maybe it was time to start asking those questions. Maybe it was time to face the fear and walk through it. Sarah stood there for a long moment, her chest tight with emotion, but something was shifting inside her, something powerful, something that felt like hope, a tiny spark in the dark. It wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to be without its challenges, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The hours seemed to stretch on as Sarah walked up and down the aisles. The plane was quiet now, most passengers asleep or lost in their thoughts. But Sarah couldn't shake the sense of restlessness that had taken hold of her. Everything felt different, like the world around her was shifting. And she was standing in the middle of it, unsure of where to go next. She had always been the one in control, the one who knew exactly what to do. But now she felt lost, like she was walking through a fog, not knowing where she was headed, or even who she really was anymore. She couldn't stop thinking about Margaret, and the way the woman had looked at her earlier, as if she had seen through all her walls, and had known exactly what Sarah was feeling. It had unsettled her, but also made her feel strangely understood. It was as if Margaret had known the pain that Sarah had been carrying for so long, the weight of expectations, the fear of disappointing others, the constant pressure to be perfect. And it made Sarah wonder just how much of herself she had buried beneath those expectations, how much of her true self had been left behind in the process of trying to please everyone around her. She glanced at Margaret's seat again. The woman was still awake, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes closed as though lost in her own thoughts. For a moment Sarah felt a tug to sit down beside her again, to speak to her, to ask more questions. But this time something held her back. It wasn't fear, but uncertainty, as if she were afraid of what Margaret might say next, afraid of the truth that might come pouring out. And yet the uncertainty didn't stop her. She felt an undeniable pull towards the woman, as if Margaret held the answers to the questions Sarah had been asking herself her whole life. Margaret seemed to sense her hesitation, and without opening her eyes she spoke, her voice calm, but with a note of knowing, "You don't have to be afraid of what comes next." She said softly. Sarah stood still, her heart pounding. As she listened, how did Margaret know what she was thinking? It was as though the old woman could read her mind. She took a deep breath and walked toward her seat, the words coming out before she could stop herself. "How do you know what I'm feeling?" Margaret's eyes opened slowly, and she looked at Sarah with a calm understanding that seemed to reach deep inside her. "Because I've been where you are," Margaret replied, her voice steady but warm. "I felt the same fears, the same doubts, and I've learned that the only way to move forward is to face them, to stop running from them." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this before, never felt so understood. It was as though Margaret had been inside her mind, had felt every worry, every tear she had shed in silence, and now here she was telling Sarah that it was okay to stop running, that it was okay to be afraid. But that didn't mean she couldn't move forward. "But I don't know how," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. She could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. "I spent so long pretending that I don't even know who I really am anymore." Margaret smiled gently, her gaze soft and reassuring. "That's the beauty of life, Sarah. You can always choose again. You can always decide who you want to be, no matter where you are in life." The simplicity of her words hit Sarah like a wave, the idea that she could choose again, that she wasn't stuck in the life she had built for herself, that there was always room for change. It gave her a glimmer of hope, but at the same time it made her feel vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. What if she made the wrong choice? What if stepping into the unknown only led her further away from the life she thought she wanted? "But what if I fail?" Sarah asked, the fear creeping into her voice. "What if I take that first step and fall?" Margaret reached out then, her hand resting gently on Sarah's arm. "You will fail," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "But that's part of it, that's part of living. You won't always have the answers. But the important thing is that you keep going, you keep choosing, even when it's hard." Sarah stared at her in silence, feeling the weight of Margaret's words settle deep inside her. She realized that this was the answer she had been looking for. All along, the fear wouldn't go away. It would always be there, lurking in the background. But it didn't have to control her. She didn't have to let it dictate her life anymore. She could choose to face it. She could choose to keep moving forward. Even when the road ahead was unclear, she could choose to live on her own terms. And for the first time in years, she felt a surge of something inside her, a quiet strength that had been buried beneath all the fear and doubt. She hadn't known it was there, but now it was awakening slowly but surely, and she knew that no matter what happened next, she was ready to take the first step into the unknown. The plane began its descent as the soft vibrations of the engines shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. Sarah's thoughts were racing faster than the plane's descent, her mind still whirling with everything that had happened in the past few hours. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had been walking through the aisles with her usual routine, her smile firmly in place. But now everything had changed. It wasn't just Margaret's words that had made a difference. It was the quiet realization inside her that she couldn't keep running from the truth anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. She couldn't keep hiding behind the walls she had built around her heart. The fear, the uncertainty, it was still there deep inside. But it didn't feel as overwhelming now. It didn't feel like it was controlling her anymore. The truth was that Sarah had always been afraid of change, afraid of what might happen if she stopped living for everyone else and started living for herself. But as the plane dipped closer to the ground, she realized that she didn't need all the answers right now. She didn't need to have everything figured out in this moment. All she needed was to take the next step, to trust herself. and just go for it. The doubt, the anxiety, they were still there. But they weren't as strong as they used to be. They didn't have the same grip on her heart. She glanced at Margaret again. The old woman had barely moved since their conversation, still sitting peacefully in her seat, her face soft with a calm that Sarah couldn't quite understand, but desperately wanted to have. Margaret turned her head slightly, catching Sarah's eye, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Sarah felt something shift inside her, as if Margaret had seen the change in her without needing to say a word. And that was enough. Sarah didn't know where this journey would take her. She didn't know what the future held, or if she would find herself lost again. But she knew that she had to take the first step. She had to stop hiding behind the mask of the perfect flight attendant, the one who was always composed, always in control, because deep down she knew she had been lying to herself. For far too long she had spent years trying to be what everyone expected of her, trying to fit into a mold that wasn't hers, trying to live up to the idea of who she thought she was supposed to be. But now she was ready to shed that skin, ready to start living for herself. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of freedom, not the kind of freedom where everything was easy and clear, but the kind where she could finally breathe, where she could make a choice without fear of judgment, where she could make mistakes and learn from them without feeling like she had to be perfect. She could feel the change inside her, the courage to face the unknown without needing a plan or guarantee. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew that the road ahead would be full of uncertainty and challenges. But Sarah had learned that uncertainty was part of life. It was where growth happened. It was where she would find the real answers, not in avoiding the unknown, but in embracing it fully. She looked out the window as the plane neared its landing, the lights of the city below shining like 1,000 tiny stars scattered across the earth. She felt the ground draw closer, but it wasn't a feeling of fear. It wasn't a feeling of dread. It was a feeling of possibility, a feeling that anything was possible, as long as she was willing to step forward and choose it. Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts once more. "You've already started your journey, Sarah," she said, her voice soft but filled with certainty. "The hardest part is behind you." Sarah turned to her and smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't a smile of perfection or an act to please anyone. It was a smile that came from within, a smile that was truly hers. "Thank you, Sarah," whispered, her voice full of gratitude. She didn't need to say anything else. The moment between them was enough. Margaret nodded gently, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You're welcome," she said as the plane touched down, the wheels hitting the runway with a smooth hum. Sarah knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new, something real. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to live on her own terms, to embrace the journey ahead, no matter where it led.